You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 12. Overdose. A full hour later, and the evil Grant was still heaving onto the grass beside the hut, having managed to persuade Craig and Michael to pull him out from under Jim's blood-wet, twitching body. Not far from the spot where the bodies had vented their contents, the still unconscious and blissfully unaware Mark lay on his now blood-spattered couch, with the monitor still reproducing unwatched the thoughts and dreams from within his mind. The cleaned-up, shaking Grant was ripe for revenge. He had already given a present to Mark for his accuracy, but sadly not for his timing. It wasn't to be seen for the rest of that day. Michael was ordered to clean away Jim's remains, a task which was nearly impossible to accomplish if it were not for the persuasive, endearing nature of Grant. Grant was determined to carry on with searching through Mark's mind. The vial of drug stolen from Mark's lab was a chemical compound called encephalin B, used in very small amounts on Fraser and Mark to stimulate the brain and so enhance awareness. The optimum dosage had been carefully worked out during clinical trials at the hospital, and only very small doses were permissible at no more than 0.3 milliliters. Grant didn't know this. He only knew from the dying Carlston that it had been used with success on Fraser, revealing the A-bomb plant. The dispensing vial now contained little more than 4 milliliters. Grant pulled apart a sterile syringe wrapping and broke out its needle from the little orange-coated capsule. Clumsily, he fixed on the needle and stuck it into the red rubber seal of the encephalin B vial, filling the 5-milliliter syringe with all the remaining drug solution, over 13 times the safe dose limit. With no preliminary aseptic procedure, he pushed the needle into the fattest vein he could find and emptied the syringe. There and then his twisted mind convinced him that he would make a good doctor. Mark's body convulsed, proving to Grant that it was working well. It wasn't. By this time, the hypnotic state had worn off, and Mark was slowly coming around. Grant didn't know anything about hypnosis and was surprised to see Mark's movements increase. He shot bolt upright and leapt from the couch onto the concrete floor, trailing the wires behind him. As he writhed about, the electrodes came away from his head, taking the rubber skull cap with them. Grant watched in amazement as Mark shook violently in response to the massive overdose of stimulant. He was now aware of his state and looked around with staring, dry eyes. The fall had caused him considerable pain as the drug began to run its course, taking control of Mark's mind, transforming reality into a state of intense surrealism. For once, Grant didn't know what to do. He could only see the results of his stupid blunder. Mark writhing and thrashing on the floor. The tremendous overdose was heightening his general awareness out of all proportion. A poison, quickly magnifying his innate sensory perception to levels far beyond his control. Ordinary noises became extraordinary, deafening, torturous sounds assailing his auditory senses, which were becoming increasingly more sensitive, supersensitive. Previously unheard sounds were becoming apparent, mixing and jangling into unbearable cacophony. Mark was devastated by the onslaught of sounds from the surrounding equipment, high frequencies generated by the fluorescent lights, and even his own heartbeat pounding like a demented drum, the rush of blood through his body sounding like a strong wind through tall trees. Hallucinations swamped his mind. Grotesque images of things and people he loved and loathed loomed and zoomed over and through him, being part of him, then a part of him, and not him at all. His auditory sense overwhelmed him as it entered the microcosm of atomic structure. He sensed he could hear the electrons struggling their way through the metal conducting crystalline structure of the electric wires, and on through the circuit boards, audibly suffering to squeeze through resistors and the other components to reach their destinations as fast as they could. Was he really sensing this? Perhaps it was purely the product of an hallucination. Dare he open his eyes? If that was what he was thinking, was he able to think? His eyes opened. The room appeared to be slowly pulsating like a camera zoom in and out, in and out. All he saw was distorted like a Salvador Dali surrealism or a Moritz Escher perspective. The room would spin and then stop, the ceiling low, then so high. Madness gripped him like a vice. Thoughts of infinity seized his racked senses that remained, as any sense at all, sending him into cosmic flight, through death, through time, through eternity, and engulfing vortices into singularity. Mark wrenched himself half up onto a chair. Grant had long gone, terrified out of his wits. Something was changing. He could just sense that. The multi-dimensional existence he thought he had now become was fighting, hunting to condense and reunite as four. Was that right? Was that the way things should be? Was time real or an illusion? The sweat bubbled through his skin and over him, his hair dripping in rat's tails. He could not see what he should see. Perhaps he was dead. I'm dead, he thought, if he could think at all. I'm dead, he said, if he could say it all. Mark finally slumped in his chair, soaked through the skin by his own body's attempt to flush out the demon drug. He had won. Just. Michael had stood in the doorway watching the battle between good and evil. He knew there was nothing he could do. He'd just waited and hoped. When finally all was peace, he moved over to Mark, who lay there, quietly panting and sobbing in the depths of exhaustion, and unconsciously stroked away his lank hair. He had become like a child in need of reassurance after a nightmare, and Michael gave that reassurance, just as he had done many times with his own child. During the next few hours, darkness fell, and both men slept until first light. Mark opened his eyes, looked around, and wondered to himself what the hell had happened. He felt as if he had been kicked senseless, as Carlston had been. He looked down to see Michael and shook him awake. "What's been going on here, Michael? Where's Grant? We must get away from here." Michael groaned as he rubbed his eyes awake, blinking into the bright morning light streaming in through the lab window. "Mark, are you all right, for God's sakes? You've been through hell and out the other side, mate," he said with a worried expression on his face. "Well, it certainly feels something like that. Tell me what happened." What happened here scared the living shit out of Grant. He and Craig left in a mighty hurry late yesterday afternoon. Craig even left his shotgun here, leaned up against the fridge. Mark listened intently as Michael recounted the horror he'd witnessed as he had watched him fight the drug's influence. He then tried to make sense of what had happened to make Grant and Craig disappear like rats from a burning ship. Looking over to the equipment and the bloody couch where he remembered laying, he picked up the empty vial from the kidney dish next to the syringes. "I remember Jim. Hey, where is Jim?" Michael hesitated before answering, which indicated something bad had happened. "Where is Jim, damn you?" Mark demanded. "Craig blew his head off," he said in his croaky, whispered voice. Why, for God's sakes?" Mark sat down, stunned at the news. "He was stupid enough to have a go at Grant and had him on the floor. Craig told me. He'd heard Grant screaming, came in and shot Jim. That's all I know. I was out digging a couple of 100 yards away, and the first I knew about it was when Craig rushed out to meet me and said that Grant was under Jim's body. I didn't even hear the shot." Michael filled in all the gruesome details. "I'm bloody glad I was unconscious, I can tell you. I had to clear that hellish mess away. Yes, I'm very sorry. It must have been terrible. I shouldn't have joked, Michael, he apologized. Craig refused to help, and Grant was too busy throwing up to care. Craig had the gun, and I did the dirty work. Michael looked ill at the thought of it all. You said you were digging, and that was for your graves, remarked Michael grimly. Mark turned back to study the vial. He remembered Jim flashing a light at him, but nothing after that. He was stricken with horror when he realized what had happened. That's it, Mike, said Mark confidently. I was given the whole bloody bottle full. What the hell am I going to do now? Said Michael, looking worried to death. I was blackmailed into this, not like Jim and the others doing it for the money. Being blackmailed should put you in the clear. I'll certainly put in a good word, assuming we make it back to civilization. Grant had to arrange for someone else to be here who had medical training, and I was already known to Grant from years back. In Charleston, we were together at that time in MI5. Grant was usually called in if there was any dirty work like this to be done. Wasn't afraid to kill if the price was right, him and Craig. I don't know where he came from. Grant has a lot of contacts, as you can imagine, in a job like that. Charleston, and then later myself, left for Civvy Street. We'd done our share in that line of work. It was about 3 months later that Grant puts in an appearance at my home in Brighton. He'd got it into his head that I knew something about 1 or 2 of his shady deals outside of MI5. In fact, I didn't know about anything. It pays to keep your nose well out of others' business. To make sure I did keep my mouth shut in any event, he stuck a hat pin through my throat. I survived except for my voice, and I swear he still keeps that hat pin in his bloody bowler. You wore a bowler even then? All those years ago? Yep. It's his trademark, if you like, that and the pinstripe suit. That bloody stick of his, though, that's something recent. You haven't asked about his voice. He was born that way, I guess. His genitals were removed when he crossed a bloke over a deal. He thought he could handle him. That's what made him such a sadistic bastard. He plays on the high voice. The suit and bowler were added for effect, Michael explained. Anyway, when he wanted someone for this job, I was easy pickings. He said he'd take out my little girl. I couldn't risk that for anything. It didn't matter about me so much, but not my Sally. He wiped a tear from the corner of his eyes. Thank you for telling me all that, said Mark. I hope everything goes well for you now. I'm sure you've nothing to worry about from the law. Grant and his gun-toting sidekick will soon be behind bars for a long time. Long enough for our peace of mind. Outside the building, they looked around. Now, where's this track lead out to? Asked Mark. I think it joins up with a concrete roadway that's part of the Army training ground. The labs are theirs, too, replied Michael, looking up and down the roadway. How the dickens did Grant swing that one? He knows a lot of people, and money talks. It's as simple as that. My God, he sure is one evil character I never want to meet again. How far do you reckon we are away from the public highway? Mark asked agitatedly. I so need to get away from this bloody place. Not far, Michael reassured him. Not if we cut across through those trees and follow the barbed wire fence. He pointed to an opening in a line of Scots pine on the other side of the lab road and led the way with Mark close behind. How do you know your way around here and which direction to take? I used to be a Boy Scout, Mark, and they showed me a map. They emerged on a small access road leading to the main public road. After climbing the barbed entrance gate and trudging for what seemed like miles, they came to a small cottage which had a telephone wire running to it. The old lady, who gradually opened the door on its chain, accepted the wrinkled $5 Mark was offering her through the crack. They could use the phone on condition she put it out on the windowsill. She wasn't going to let them inside at any price. They hadn't seen how they looked.